Tardes, hello. ¿Me oyen? I think I may give you reasons to hate me a little bit because I know the conversation is very good. Yet, I have to call your attention to the front. We have a couple of things to do. I hope, can you hear me? No? Is that because I'm talking too soft? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank God that you're testing with me. Okay. Thanks for paying attention. It is my duty to inform you that if you think this food was a mistake, it is not. We actually have a good spread for us, and for that we have to thank the Ford Foundation who's sponsoring the project. Our beloved program officer Hector Cordero had to represent President Ubiña in a meeting and therefore couldn't be with us here today. I wouldn't argue with my boss either, but he sent his regrets and he is really eager to read the final papers and so forth. So when you see him, please thank him on our behalf for the wonderful support that the foundation has given us to sustain this very important work. So my job here now is about done. I want to call to the podium my colleague José Luis Morin, who's the director of the Puerto Rican Policy Initiative, and he will say a few words about that and then introduce our keynote speaker, who's really going to talk about policy for the disadvantaged in the city of New York. So please welcome José Luis Morin.
Thank you and good afternoon. It's so good to see this group of people assembled here for this very important topic that we're talking about today. As Edwin had mentioned, there is a new initiative at this Centro, which is moving forward with something that probably many of you are familiar with or even participated in to some extent, the Centro Search Conference, which took place last May. This conference today is actually one of the follow-ups to one of the particular themes of the Centro Search process. There were 6 themes in general. And there's going to be a follow-up to that conference, which will happen now in May 2010. And along with that is an expansion of how we can get this information out to a broader audience, and therefore that conference will be much larger than the one that took place this past year. And we will also be publishing many of the research documents that are coming out of this whole process. Among them, the kind of research that you're seeing today, and that's been presented throughout the day. So we're appreciative of all of you being here because this is part of that important process of following up on the Centro Search topics that are so central. This one being among them. And you'll be hearing more from the Centro about the follow-up conference. And in fact, if you look at your packets, there's also a request for research and policy proposals on Puerto Rican social conditions, which gives you a little bit more of the detail about the request for papers to be published on these specific themes that are part of the Centro Search initiative. I'm also very pleased to be able to present our keynote speaker at this luncheon. For those of you that have been here in New York, that have been in touch with any of the issues that we've been dealing with today, you will know our speaker as really a leading advocate for the poor and for economic development in communities of color. David Jones is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Community Service Society of New York, a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that promotes economic advancement and full civic participation for low-income New Yorkers. Mr. Jones writes bi-weekly newspaper columns in the New York Amsterdam News and El Diario La Prensa, and a weekly blog on Huffington Post website that serves to educate the public and the government officials on issues of importance to minority and poor communities. There's a much longer description of his illustrious career in your package, but needless to say, he's a major figure here in the city, and especially with regard to the topic that we're dealing with today. So if you can, please join me in welcoming David Jones.
Well, I'd like to thank you for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure, though I always am concerned about talking to people over meals, because if it gets really bad, they throw rolls and stuff. But I hope you bear with me as I go through it. Let me just set the frame before I start to talk about some of the things that I think may be of interest at this gathering. First of all, CSS is an odd creation. It was really created 160 years ago plus as an effort to deal with poverty in the city of New York. It was not done as any great favor to the poor. It was really assembled by some of the elites of New York who were terrified of all the immigrant waves of immigration coming into the city that were threatening, in their view, political stability and social order, as well as health care and the rest. This notion that charities were really created for the poor, I'll send you some of the letters, and I'll clearly disabuse you of that. These were not necessarily nice people. But 160 years forward, the organization still follows some of the basic precepts that our founders were engaged in, which is basically not only direct service. We were, for a long time, the premier social work agency in the city of New York, actually founded the Columbia School of Social Work, and had at one point nearly 500 social workers working at CSS. We also, from the very beginning, were engaged in research and advocacy, digging into the issue of what poverty was like in the city of New York and trying to come up with different interventions to actually start to solve those. In healthcare, we created the Hospital of Special Surgery. We were the leaders in the tuberculosis efforts for many years. We created the first new law tenement, the first public baths, which make it a little easier in New York on the subway. All of those things were sort of some of the initial work that CSS did back then. Fast forward to today, we're not the same kind of organization. Thank God in many ways. We are basically known as a research institution, though we do direct service. I can talk about some of that. And what I almost can describe, and as I have my colleague here, Juan Cartagena, who's VP, not only General Counsel, but VP for Policy, will also tell you, we are basically engaged in trying to do directed research that can be implemented in policy change. Since I'm sort of out of a political operation, I always try to see what political movement we can make to try to address some of the issues that we begin to uncover. And I think that's important not only for CSS, I think particularly we who are trying to represent disenfranchised and groups that are under pressure can never see a research project without seeing an advocacy agenda behind it. I think that's our role at this point, particularly as we emerge into the new majority in the city and of New York. As you know, largely because of work of another of my former colleagues, Richie Perez, this city council we have is for the first time dominated by African and American, Latino and Asian representatives. We are now the majority in the council. Whether we can bring change because of it is still to be seen. But we are there in the hopes that many of us had nearly 20 years ago, to have that change start to reflect itself. So the latent power, both in the city council, in the state legislature, and in Congress, is there. So I think sometimes we're still moving from a deficit model. Oh, what can we beg the New York Times to do? There's power here. It has to be power now that is driven through our own elected representatives, using the best in research that we can now draw on institutions like this and many of you in this room. And I think that's the difference. I don't want to be a deficit model anymore. We have power, and we can do things. That was a glass of wine. As I know. I'm going to be talking about a couple of research things that we've been working on that directly relate to what you're working on today. One of them is something called the unheard third, which I think is in its 9th year. This was an idea that I completely said was silly when it was brought to me by one of my senior researchers, that we would use polling data to try to get a fix on what was happening at people at 200% of poverty or less. In the years that have passed, it's become a dominant instrument for CSS, not only in terms of trying to convince the public generally, opinion makers and the legislature about what's going on at the base, but also as a tool to inform our own judgments about what should be done. There's a certain arrogance. I grew up in Crown Heights in the 1950s and 60s. I'm sort of fixated. I know what poverty is like, and my attitudes are potentially what must be right. Well, you visit, as many of us have, Boys and Girls High School, and try to talk to the young people and the challenges they're in now. My context is not right anymore. It doesn't fit their reality. And we recognize that the tool of interviewing by phone for 30 minutes 1,200 New Yorkers at basically below the poverty line or near was a chance to have an exchange here that I think advocates sometimes forget. I've got to get into the base. If I'm claiming to represent a constituency, I got to know what they're talking about and know what they want, rather than what I think will fix their situation. And I think it's very important. There's a chauvinism that often creeps into this work, where you suddenly ignore who you're trying to treat with and assume you know what's best. And I'll tell you one area that this came up, and then I'll get into my real address. I was shocked. I threw in a question 4 or 5 years ago as to what school reform should look like from the base, from people at 200% of poverty or less. What would they think would move the system? And the answers, the first 2 answers were smaller class size, better teaching, better paid teaching, but the third was a focus on career and technical education. Now, as a black New Yorker, I got to tell you, this is a big shock. I came up with a time where the debate was very real between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, that really only high-skilled, professional education was appropriate. College was the only thing you could talk about in my household, or else literally there was almost war. That was the dominant discussion among black middle class for many years. But what happened at the base, as things began changing in poor communities, was a realization of 2 things. First of all, the dropout rate, which I know they keep claiming they're moving, particularly for young blacks and Latinos, particularly males, is beyond appalling. For black men, less than 10% graduate with a Regents degree. The dropout rate, which they claim is shifting up and down around 50%, has stuck at 50%, including GED and general diploma for most of this group. And that's been 10 years ago. It's true now. I know there's reform in the works, but I think the latest 8th grade results, which showed the discrepancy on the math test based on a national, shows that particularly African American and Latinos have not appreciably moved up in terms of their outcomes. And this may be blamed on the young people and their parents, but I'll tell you, I won't get into that particular rant. This is also very intentional in terms of the resources that are being given to these populations. Be that as it may, I've understood that career and technical education was a reasonable reaction because there's been a change at the base, a recognition that to have a skill can mean entry into the middle class. I don't care if you're college educated, and we're seeing it now. Starbucks is now requiring some college of their applicants. It's not a great living. So there's a difference that's going on here where people are recognizing they want their young people to be able to not only get educated, but get a skill that will allow them to really participate and move up the economic ladder. My old paradigm is not working, and I have to start to weave that into the work we did in CSS. But the unheard third this time, this was a survey that was conducted relatively recently in July and August of this year, began to indicate something that is directly relating to my remarks here today. It began to reveal that of all groups in the city of New York, the Latino community is the hardest hit by this recession, bar none. And it was showing basically things that were shocking even to my researchers. Of the people responding who identified themselves as Latino, 26% had reported losing their job, flat out. Okay, higher than any other group. Just in this is sort of the pre-wave of the recession. We're not taking in what's going on now. 33% had fallen behind in rent or mortgage payments. 26% could not fill a prescription because of lack of money or insurance, but almost half of low-income Latinos had no money in savings in case of an emergency. Somehow there's a disconnect when I talk to the people in the city about the spike in homelessness in the city of New York. If I have no money at all, zero, and someone gets sick in my household, or I lose my job as 26%, it's over. There are no cushions here. And I think that kind of sort of precarious existence is going to be driving the condition, particularly for the Latino community, and particularly because of the job characteristics that you've heard earlier this morning. And that's why this becomes serious. My difficulty with this, despite everyone accepting, actually Joel Klein uses all my statistics on the issue of educational improvement. There is a general sense that there's an increased focus on education in the city of New York. No one is taking seriously the issue of literally a huge cohort in New York that are on the edge. And you see signs of this everywhere. Instead of embracing when the homeless numbers came up, that the Coalition for the Homeless is going back to say you're suddenly having people sleeping on floors again and the rest, that's just an aberration. They don't clearly understand the key struggles that are going on because of this recession, and instead of proactively going out ahead of this, they're taking the position that we can do incremental moves here, that we don't have to change anything, that we can talk about conditional cash transfers, or we can come up with a nursing program for 200 people when I have 400,000 unemployed. I think moving this debate away from the fact that we're still dealing with many in an administration, both here, state, national, who want to believe we're in basically a full employment economy, that we're not at the same levels, at least for blacks and Latinos, that are the same as the Great Depression in the city of New York. We hit 25%. We're there for many of our communities now. But I don't get the sudden running to the barricades. We're going to make a major investment and a scaled investment to come up with this kind of crisis. And I think that's where our research and our advocacy has to become harder and harder and harder, using our electeds, if they want to stay elected, to be the forerunners of this argument. Because this can't continue. The loss here is very dangerous. I can only talk from my own experience. We're starting to see numbers across the country showing that blacks and Latinos are not only unemployed at double the rate, but for much longer times. Any of us who've grown up in these neighborhoods know the danger once people have been unemployed for 6 months, a year, of how they can get back into the labor market. The other disturbing things is we've always sort of got accustomed to high rates of unemployment among the young. Now we're seeing a dramatic shift. We're not having unemployment only among the young. We're seeing full-time workers, never been unemployed, never took anything, who are suddenly becoming unemployed and not being able to get back into the workforce. What that does, generationally, it's one thing if I'm 18, no, I'm not working, and it'll come. But if my uncle, my father, my aunt, everyone is out of work, the level of hopelessness and entrenched problems multiply geometrically. And I think that, too, has to be looked at as we go forward. Let me just talk a little bit about another report that we're working on, essentially, and I'll tell you what we're hoping to do and where we think pressure points are available. The education issue is becoming dominant. I don't know if many of you saw, looking at black Americans, that currently there's a 24% unemployment rate for blacks who don't have a high school diploma. That's also true with this community as well. The problem, and I talked about Starbucks suddenly moving up the educational ladder, requiring all sorts of things that are ridiculous. I mean, I know I like my espresso, but it doesn't take a college, 2 years of college to do this. But because of the economy under such stress, slowly people who don't have high school are becoming literally unemployable. And that problem, we think, will persist for many years. The economists that I'm worried about, and it seems to be coming together now, are talking about a recession that ends, but unemployment rates that hover in this 8 to 10% range for the general population, and an automatic double for blacks, Latinos, and Puerto Ricans and others, may persist through 2014. And the reason for that is when we did our poll, and it sort of showed up, while people were saying 26% were saying that they lost their job, a higher number were saying that their hours and wages had been dropped. So there's a lag that you and many of the economists in this room know, that when employers begin to see some daylight in terms of improved conditions, they're not going out to hire. They're going to ramp up hours and wages for their existing workforce. And only after a period of time when they push their workers' productivity and driven them crazy. My son just got married. His wife is a young second-year lawyer at a big law firm in Boston. So they stopped hiring, but now she's working a 60-day week. And because everyone's clamoring as young lawyers to get a job, they, essentially what can the young people say? Well, 70 hours, whatever you need. Essentially, they're going to be playing that game with workers across the economic spectrum. Because of the fear of not being employed, people will be willing to essentially work for no or little increased wage and work many more hours before these employers start to come back and are desperate to hire people back into the economy. Given the fact that high school diplomas are sort of the bare minimum to enter this economy, and given the fact that we estimate that more than 1 million New Yorkers of working age are without a high school diploma, you'd think that we would be making an aggressive effort to graduate everyone we could. I think, I don't have to talk to Luis about this and others here, we haven't done a very good job of that. But we picked this up with a study we just released that got a lot of play on GED. Which is a program that allows somebody to sit for an exam and get a high school equivalency. After a certain age in the New York City system, you can't get a high school diploma by going back to school. You have to get a GED. That was the only way to do it. The difficulty is we're dead last in the nation in GED. And I met with the entire regions, and it was clear these guys had not invested a thought into this area. I don't want to draw my implications of it, but the reason they didn't care was who was at issue here, because GED basically is a last resort degree for blacks and Latinos. And it didn't matter. As we push harder, the bureaucrats have come up with everything imaginable about why they're not doing it. It was complex. We had never looked at it carefully. But when I look at it, with states like Alabama and Mississippi cleaning New York's clock on essentially GED passage, what am I supposed to draw from this? That people were committed to our million-plus individuals who desperately need some credential to participate? Or were they basically showing a generalized contempt because of who these people were and how politically powerless we were perceived to be? I think it's another gloss that we have to come to grips with. This is not a friendly system, and it will only respond when we make a serious demand for change. It's not a huge, expensive demand, not unreasonable. Everyone says they want it, but I don't see anyone really putting any energy into it. And that, too, is one of the areas I'd like to talk about in closing, is how we should go about dealing with it. Then let's talk about the third rail of virtually every community I go in, and that's our formerly incarcerated, particularly young men. When we started digging into the question of unemployment rates and something called disconnected youth, which I'll talk about briefly, we did not want to deal with anything involving the formerly incarcerated. If you try to deal with high unemployment rates and high rates of disconnect without dealing with this issue, you're fooling yourself. I have this discussion with a lot of people. There is perhaps it's a men's thing. There's a certain amount of age amnesia that goes on. And I think it's true across the genders of what you're like when you're 15 to 17. I like to forget it. As a matter of fact, when I bring it up, my wife says, "Stop it. You don't want to tell them that story." But we somehow have looked back on young people in this age group, and now they even have brain science that shows what it's about. They make a mistake very similar what Jeb Bush's children did in their narcotics arrest. But Jeb Bush's children may very well end up on a national campaign somewhere in a couple of years. Our kids, for the same drug possession, can end up with a permanent felony record and civil death, never working again in their lives at all. As soon as it comes up, and this is one, and the work we're doing with reentry, the stories you hear of people who make a mistake, and not a big mistake on the terms of white-collar crime, in my view. They make a mistake, no one was hurt, and suddenly every job they come to, even if they get advanced degrees, becomes shut off to them. The numbers we have incarcerated now are 63,000. They're down a bit. 23,000 on parole. They don't even count the hundreds of thousands who have criminal records. It is clearly, particularly among men, but also now among women, driving a major problem of unemployment that is not being adequately addressed. We have to take that, too, as we start to work on this issue. Finally, let me just talk a little bit about a couple of other studies and then what we think we should do about it. Disconnected Youth was a study that really helped shape CSS today. I had no clue. The researcher who did the study has now been drafted by the Bloomberg administration as Mark Levitan as their head of policy, though I keep teasing him, he hasn't come out with another report like this since, but that's not fair. But essentially we started to uncover the fact that we have about 200,000 young people 16 to 24 pre-recession who are neither working or in school. I think all of us have seen them. I go back to Brevoort houses where my father's political life started, and you can see them 10 deep on the stoops and park benches. Literally, many of them, if not most, have not gotten any credential. Many have criminal convictions. Many have other problems that have emerged. This problem of disconnected youth really is the bellwether of a future New York if we're not careful. Those numbers were all pre-recession. The problem of dealing with young people who have been pushed out or dropped out of school, almost inevitably when you interview them, not because of the rigor of the academic work, but because of family problems and general contempt or obvious contempt by the educational system they were involved in. This is the future for our communities, and it's not going well. The silver lining, if any, is this is a national problem that for once doesn't seem to have necessarily only impact people of color. All across the country, we've decided to disinvest. Didn't really matter. High school, you know, there were some you'd send to college, the rest could drop out, they'd get a job. We were a full employment economy, and if you were white, it certainly made it easier. But all across the country, and I think some of the explosion in meth rates in middle America and the hostility that's starting to be capitalized on the far right of the Republican Party is picking up on the disaffection of people who see no hope for their children, because they don't have credentials to compete, not only in their own local economy, but certainly not in a global economy. And they want somebody to scapegoat. We've been through this before, obviously, in the South, where they played white sharecroppers like crazy to convince them, no, it wasn't because the big producers of cotton were ripping them off. It was because those colored folks had gotten emancipation. So we have to take this seriously, that we can be scapegoated both as immigrants, as blacks and Latinos pretty well, and they're beginning to do it as they're desperate to explain to middle America without much skills why things are going in reverse. And I think we have to recognize that that's the game being played and not necessarily alienate us and look for American labor to start being serious about what we're going to do for laboring people and moving them all forward, because we can't do this in isolation. I'm very desperately afraid of that going forward. Percent when asked, do you go to work sick? They said, yes, of course we go to work sick. The interesting thing, we were able to use in the debate before the City Council, and there was no other data set on this for a local thing. And as a matter of fact, I'll bring one of the vignettes, the only attack on us that was sort of bizarre. But we were able to use that data, which was very fresh, July of August of this year, to show that if you deny paid sick leave to people, and they got the flu, they're in there at the White Tower, coughing their heads off, because they have no option, because if they or their child is sick, they have to be there. They can't afford to lose the wage. This doesn't seem like a great leap of faith, but I assure you people were arguing it didn't happen. And you needed the data sets to prove it. And in this case, the rejoinder from our friends at the New York City Partnership was a 1,200 sample wasn't big enough to really get a clear understanding. No other data presented, but no, that's not big enough. So data can be very powerful. We'll see if I get what we want. We haven't had a rejoinder yet. This is very similar to when OSHA rules were put in and they had guards on the meat slicer and business protested that you're going to mess up our business. The notion of a legion of low-wage workers in food service and child care and a host of other places not having the right to take a sick day off when they are really sick is insanity. It doesn't take any great leap of faith. So those are where data becomes important, particularly as they come down to our communities. Similarly, when we did a small monograph on the issue of unemployment rates in public housing, again, overwhelmingly black and Latino, and found the rates of individuals, and particularly young people who are unemployed, based on old data, almost 2 years out of date, showed that at a minimum, we have about 25,000 16 to 24-year-olds who are out of work and out of school in public housing. We got to talk to Nydia Velasquez, who's been pushing for years on the issue of something called Section 3. Section 3 becomes interesting because there's a rule in public housing. All publicly supported housing is supposed to give first priority for capital and service provision to people living in and about public housing. Last year they spent $1.3 billion. They hired 9 people under this program in the city of New York. It's not enforced. It's not enforced here. It's not enforced anywhere. What Nydia and Maxine Waters are collectively doing is strengthening the Section 3 provision to make it mandatory. To say that, look, we're going to be, don't talk to me about stimulus. I can put together works programs with thousands just based upon the run rate of $1 billion a year that goes through public housing. It's not going to solve my 30,000 or my 25,000 unemployed, but at least I can point to young people saying there is a job of last resort that will provide you with a work history, money in your pocket, and also help, if we get our way, to working towards a GED or other credential if you don't have it. My issue has always been, I used to be head of youth services for the city of New York. I've seen great programs in the city of New York. Every time I'm looking at one, it's too small bore to handle the scale of the problem we're up against. When I'm dealing with hundreds of thousands unemployed, I don't want a great program with 50. I don't want conditional cash transfers that impact based upon full employment, that you have to drive people to help their own kids. I want programs like they did when Roosevelt was president that deal with tens of thousands. That's what I don't see happening here. And as I've had a debate with one of the deputy mayors about this, I said, it's not that I don't like your programs. I think they're nice. But the thing has moved on. You're now dealing with a city with nearly 500,000 unemployed. That doesn't work anymore. And if you can't do it yourself, I want you in Washington every day demanding that this kind of help come from the federal government for not only New York, but Chicago, for LA, all these cities that are suffering under the same kind of burden. And I haven't seen that kind of excitement or urge by the leadership yet. So I think one of the ways we take it, and I get back to Nydia and her work, is we have to come up with programs that work, that have scale, and we have some political people already in place to start driving the agenda. That's the way that starts to happen. In the same case as what we did with Charlie Rangel. When we did early reports with Charlie, again on the issue of disconnected youth, he proposed a tax credit for private employers of $6,000 for a private employer who would hire somebody who was 6 months out of school, 6 months out of work. Now that's coming in. It got into the stimulus. Now the question is, can you ramp that up to be significant enough to have the impacts we're talking about? So let me not go much further. I think there are ways that we can use our delegation. We're now up to 57 Black and Latino members in the Congress. We dominate the City Council. We have a huge part of the delegation in Albany. What I want to see is the same kind of things I saw when I was a young intern for Bobby Kennedy. When the tobacco interests were dealing with the early stages of efforts way back when, they blocked Congress from moving to make sure that the tobacco subsidies went through. This delegation has all that power. They're beginning to express it. But I think we have to provide, as academics and advocates, the ammunition to our electeds willing to go. I mean, there'll be some who won't go, but most will. They both, this makes sense. To give them the ammunition to make this fight and not allow people to just blow it off as being self-interest or narrowly cast. In this interface between academics and advocates and the elected officials, I see a role we can play that can really move things for substantial numbers of our constituency. And that's where I'd like to make partnerships with many of you here, and Juan will, as Juan's already talking about it, to make that happen, because I don't think this notion of waiting for people out of the goodness of their hearts to say it's terrible what's happening to Latino youth, terrible what's happening to Puerto Rican youth, terrible what's happening to black youth, and then allow us to be worse in the country in GED passage and not think much of it. And then also to see the major poverty initiative that our parents should be given a conditional cash transfer when they have no access to jobs whatsoever. I have to make some cost here for electeds, and our delegation, our votes, are one of the ways to get that done, not the only one. And this is not an academic exercise for us. It may be for others. This is a very personal effort that I think has huge benefits and will be remembered as a turning point if we can bring it off. Thank you very much.
This afternoon we're going to look at issues very similar to those that we were looking at this morning, but we're going to look at them and get a chance to make some comparisons in Puerto Rico. So we'd like to welcome three of our presenters from Puerto Rico, from the University of Puerto Rico, and one from Hunter College. So let's start out with Ángel Ruiz, Dr. Ángel Ruiz, Dr. Aloida Rivera Betancourt from the University of Puerto Rico. They know well the 5 and the 2 signals. Muchas gracias, bienvenido. Low wage labor markets in Puerto Rico.
Good afternoon. I would like to start giving thanks to the Center of Puerto Rican Studies for supporting my research on the labor market and the goods and service market in Puerto Rico. My analysis differs somewhat from the analysis conducted this morning. At the beginning, I thought that was very important in order to reach any conclusion about wage structure in Puerto Rico, to start with the study of the labor market and the goods and service market in Puerto Rico. So I started by studying the structural change by occupations in Puerto Rico. Then, at the second stage, I started doing analysis using input-output techniques of the change, the structure of the Puerto Rican economy. And the third stage, then, using the analysis of the structural change by occupation and structural change by industry, reach some conclusion for the wage structure in Puerto Rico. In other words, what I did was, since the labor market demand is a derived demand from the goods and service market, I could not reach any conclusion on low wage or any conclusion on the wage market without analyzing the economy for the last 40 years. So what I did first, I did a paper on the occupational structure of the economy, change in the occupational structure of the economy for the last 40 years. Then I proceeded to do an analysis using input-output tables of the structural change in the economy of Puerto Rico. And in the third step, I integrated the human resource with the input-output analysis to make a model for forecasting or for projection purposes, in order, a model that served as a backing for the conclusion I reached on the wage structure of the economy. In summarizing, first, I did a study of the occupational structure, 500 occupations. For presentation purposes, I aggregated to 13 occupational categories. Then I proceeded to do an input-output analysis comparing the input-output structure of 1963, 1982, 1992, and updated matrix for 2007. And later on, in the paper of structural occupational structure, I also I analyzed the employment change by gender. In other words, my first paper is a study on the change in the occupational structure by gender. And as a sub-product of the gender analysis, we also analyzed the wage gap. And we found out that there is a significant wage gap in Puerto Rico, especially in low-wage occupation. And then I analyzed the structure of the economy, and I also found out that most of the change in the structure of the economy of Puerto Rico had to do with a change from manufacturing sector to service sector. And then service sector is quite different from the manufacturing sector in terms of productivity, and therefore it has some implications for low-wage workers. For instance, it's not the same to have a good manufacturing jobs and having good service sector jobs. Of course, the service sector is very heterogeneous. I mean, we have telecommunications and other sectors that are high-pay wage, but that's the way I did. And the reason is simple. I cannot reach any conclusion on wage structure if I don't study the economy before. So that's what I did. And I'm sorry if somebody misunderstood me, but that's the logical way to do things. I mean, you have to analyze the structure of the economy and the structure of the occupation and the labor market, and then reach conclusion about low wage or high wage. And that's I mean, like a flowgrams. First study the labor market, then study the economics, the good market, and then make implication for low and high wages, for the structural wage. That's what I did. In the process, since I analyzed it by gender, then I also have a good section on wage gap, done for the first time, or I mean, not many studies on wage gap in Puerto Rico, really. No. And that I did for 500 occupations. Then, once we analyze both the occupational structure and the industrial structure of the economy, we proceeded to analyze the wage structure. And I should make the point that the wage structure analysis is an ongoing analysis because we haven't finished it. I only have some preliminary results that Edwin asked me to present today, because Edwin told me that the focus of the conference is low wage. But, and then I decided to present something on low wage, although this morning few papers mentioned rigorously the low wage market and with empirical data. So I talked to my colleague from Mayagüez campus, that he's a professor of economics and business administration in Mayagüez campus, to help me on this analysis. And I will in order to not to delay too much my presentation, I would like her, before I sent Edwin both papers, the first part on the occupational structure and the second part on the industrial structure and the integration of the both in a model of input-output cum human resource analysis for planning purposes. And I also, since the paper are too long, I made some summaries for the first part, a summary for the second part that is available, I imagine, from the center, because they have the information. In case you want to read the whole 55 pages per paper, and then he also will send it to you. So I let now Loida Rivera Betancourt, my ex-student in the University of Puerto Rico, I graduated from Birmingham University in England, to to finish my presentation. That part of the main ongoing analysis that had to do with wage structure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and nice being here in New York in spite of the cold. Okay, but just for a change. And that means that I'm much younger than you, okay? Oh, yeah. So let's start here. Let's start here with the discussion of our recent research on median wage by occupation and industry. And the main objective of this part of the work is to estimate a median wage by occupation and compare each occupation with the median wage income for the economy as a whole. So we took a 500 plus occupational table published for 2000. I'm so sorry I cannot show you the stuff. And it was reduced to a minimum of 22 occupational categories that you can appreciate in table 1. The source of data for employment and income was the USA Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, State Occupational Employment, and wage estimates for Puerto Rico. The annual median income for the 500 plus occupations for both years, that means years 2000 and year 2008, was multiplied by 2/3 to comply with the criteria used by most members of this conference participating. Each of the occupations' 2/3 median wage income was then compared with the 2/3 median wage income for the total economy to determine which occupation median wage income was below the median for the economy as a whole. As you see on table 1, it shows the employment, the mean wage income, and median annual wage income for the above mentioned occupational categories that we see here. And it shows a great concentration of employment in occupational categories such as sales workers, administrative support occupations, and in a lesser degree in precision manufacturing occupations. Most of these occupations are in the service industry sectors, as we demonstrated in other parts of this work, as the papers that Angel already has mentioned. A quick look at the table shows that the median wage income for these occupational categories are below the median for the economy as a whole. Now on table 2, can you please go down? Table 2, please. Okay, thank you. It shows rates of growth from 2000 to the year 2008 for mean, median wage income, and employment. Categories such as architecture and engineering occupations, community and social services occupations, healthcare support, and protected service occupations experience a reasonable median wage income growth rate. And what we understand as reasonable is an annual rate of growth between 3 and 4%. An analysis of the 500 plus occupational table, that you won't find it here. We have it in an appendix, a statistical appendix, depicts the case of architecture and engineering occupations registering a high rate of growth due to a significant increase in the median wage income of electronics engineers, architectural and civil drafters, and environmental engineering technicians. In the case of community and social services occupations, rehabilitation counselors, health education, and social and human service assistants, these occupations experience the fastest rate of growth. Occupations such as dentists, general dietitians and nutritionists, physician assistants, registered nurses, nuclear medicine technologists and radiologic technologists and technicians were responsible for the high rate of growth in the category of healthcare support occupations. Table 3, a little bit further down, thanks. Table 3 shows a median income under the assumption that 2/3 of the magnitude reflects low-wage workers. As shown in the table, annual median wage income of all occupation increased at an annual rate of growth of 3.14%, a rate of growth not too significant considering that the estimates are in current prices. And why? Because of current prices. Real values were not used because of the unreliability that we have now of the existing price indexes. In an experiment that my colleague made, deflating wages by the Consumer Price Index from 2000 to 2008, it rendered negative changes in wage growth. 2/3 of the total economy median wage income will range from $9,749 to $12,481 respectively. During the year 2000, 9 of the 22 occupational categories were under the 2/3 median wage income for the economy as a whole. But on the year 2008, and listen carefully, 15 out of the same 22 occupational categories were under the 2/3 median wage income for the economy as a whole. That is that 6 major additional occupational categories are now under the annual median wage of the economy during the year 2008. A look at the paper on the manpower matrix, it shows that most of the employment in these low wage categories is located in the service sector of the economy. And just give me a break for the implications of these findings. I think it's important, I mean.
You got 5 minutes?
Yeah. Got 5 minutes? Now I'll just skip some of these and I'll go to the implications of these findings that they're more important. For the year 2000, most less skilled occupations were below the median wage income for the total economy. However, highly skilled occupations were very well paid and well appraised in the year 2000. In the span of 8 years, all high skilled occupational categories fell below the island's median wage income. Therefore, less skilled workers were worse off than in the year 2000. Right now, about 1 or 2 weeks ago, the government announced the official data on the Department of Education and stated that about 40% of our students have a dropout rate. I mean, students from K-12, 40% is a dropout rate. And in 2007, more than half of the students failed the Puerto Rico learning test on a national level, especially in mathematics and science. A plausible explanation of these figures that we are presenting is the long-run trend of the Puerto Rican labor market to be biased first towards occupations requiring post-secondary education. because of the structural change of the economy towards a more capital-intensive, knowledge-intensive based economy. These findings can be corroborated in another research that we submitted for this conference. As we already know, labor demand is derived because it is a function of the commodity demand. If there's no demand for what you're offering, then you will not have a job. That's obvious. The Puerto Rican economy is evolving towards the service sector and workers displaced from manufacturing industries. And new less skilled workers joining the labor force are geared towards low productivity service sectors like trade, domestic, and protective services. High skilled workers tend to be higher in high productivity service sectors like telecommunications, finance, and real estate. The other explanation, because there's not only one, there can be several explanations, can be the prolonged economic crisis in Puerto Rico that has accelerated the erosion of the wage level even amongst highly skilled occupational groups. And when I'm talking about highly skilled occupational groups, I'm including doctors, nurses, dentists, and everything that is related to the health sector. Another explanation can be the trend towards part-time contract and outsourcing as a means of compensating the stringent labor laws that strangle the labor market. That means that Puerto Rico is already moving towards what we call a contingent labor force. In a parallel piece of research, we studied the process of outsourcing from the manufacturing sector to the service sector of the economy. And we found that a significant increase of many firms are already subcontracting otherwise many tasks that were done as part of the manufacturing process. And now they're done in lower wage service sectors. And this is another factor that we think accounts for the increase in low wage workers. And this paper will be forthcoming and published. And input-output,
the National Input-Output Association.
A National Input-Output Association, sorry, it slipped me. It must be the lunch. We find that the mean wage and the standard deviation can be more reliable indicators because the median tends to be biased towards lower values, and it's most important to look at the mean. And although the mean is sensitive to extreme values, and we're very aware of that, the standard deviation is what depicts the distribution of the data around the mean. So we also look not only at the two-thirds criteria, but also at the whole mean standard deviation and the coefficient of variation. Why we do that? Because Puerto Rico has a different labor market, and we cannot export parameters and criteria from a labor market here in the mainland toward the labor market in the island. And the reason is because partly the purchasing power parity is very different. As you well know, that Lawrence Summers in the 80s made a study for the United Nations comparing purchasing power parities across many countries, rich and poor alike. And he found out that even though some countries do really have very, very low income, people can manage because first, the consumption composition is very different, and obviously you can, in some countries, live a little bit cheaper. So that's why in Puerto Rico, wages may be lower, but still we can manage and make good living. And besides, labor laws are very strict. You cannot fire people at will. If you fire somebody, you must have a justifiable cause, otherwise you will end in the courts, and it happened a lot. So that's the reason why many industries are moving towards part-time or service contracts. For example, we analyzed wages by industry since 1963. That's the other table that is separate from...
Oh, okay.
No, that one. Okay. for a lapse of 45 years, using input-output data bank, estimated the median, the mean standard deviation, and the coefficient of variation, and found that the median wage for all the economy increased for the whole 45-year period. The mean has also been increasing for the whole period for all the economy, but as you can see, there is a greater dispersion also in the standard deviation. So this can be an indicator of a widening of the wage gap between low wage and high wage employment. And finally, respect to the wage gaps, we also analyzed in the first paper submitted to this project the gender problem in the Puerto Rico labor market. It has been shown that women have made great strides in the labor market. Right now, I teach in the western side of the island, the campus, where you find the School of Engineering. It used to be a male bastion, but right now, more than half of graduates in engineering, in all fields of engineering, are women, not men. I mean, I'm very proud of that, because it used to be an all-male school. So even though women have been advancing in engineering, in sciences, in law, in the health sector, you name it, they're still behind in wages. That cannot be explained by variables that don't have to do with cultural bias. So it seems that the widening wage gap mentioned above seems to weigh against female workers in mostly all occupation and industries, whether high skill or low skill employment. Thank you very much for bearing with me.
Thank you, Dr. Ruiz, Dr. Rivera. I'd like to present to you Dr. Maria Echantegui. Bueno, this says Enchantegui, misspelled right here. From the University of Puerto Rico, she's a known economist. Así que, cuando usted diga, María. Puerto Rico's forgotten half. Maybe more than half, Maria.
Okay, there you go. I'm sorry.
Okay. You can put it in a slide, in what do you call slideshow? Slideshow up.
See? Right there?
No, arriba.
No.
From the beginning. They are from beginning. As they are over there in the left. Slideshow from beginning.
Yeah.
Just hold it.
I got confused a little.
Well, good afternoon. I'm going to be talking about what I'm calling Puerto Rico Forgotten Half, and the term borrowed from the 1988 commission of the William T. Grant Commission about the forgotten half non-college youth in America. And I think that, and a lot of that was talked also by the prior speaker at the lunch time about how we have forgotten about this population. In Puerto Rico, 51% of the population ages 25 to 64, and 48% of those ages 25 to 34 do not have any type of college education. So it's really the half. This is Puerto Rico forgotten half, as most policy attention is directed towards post-secondary education. The expansion of the public university system, economic development policies tilted towards sector hiring better educated workers, concerns with brain drain, biotechnology, and the knowledge economy, all are examples of the focus on the college education. In the meantime, the half of the population that do not attend college has been forgotten. Workforce development programs for the non-college population are practically non-existent. High school dropouts remain high. School-to-work programs have been abandoned, and K-12 public schools continue to perform poorly. So what I'm going to be working is what skills do these workers need to enter the jobs that are there. I can see that we may think that, or I mean, the policymaker may think that Puerto Rico needs the higher skilled job to better position themselves for the growing economy. But the reality is that most jobs growth in Puerto Rico occurs in occupations that do not require a college education. Among the top 10 occupations with most demand, 6 do not require college education. Instead, the requirement is only minimum education and with a short training. Among the top 10 with the most openings, 9 require only minimum education or short-term training. And what we are going to see now is that in the survey that I use, is a survey of employers in Puerto Rico, 65% of the job openings were filled by people that did not have a college education. What are the industries that employ these non-college workers? Well, most of them in Puerto Rico, especially the construction workers, is very big for hiring non-college workers. Have 76,000 employees. Manufacturing follows, and retail. You know that the NICE DBI retail 45 and 48 code. Retail 45, which is like the general stores. Then accommodation and food services and other services. And as I said before, out of the top 15 occupations with the most employment growth, 9 do not require a college education. Of the job openings filled by the last hire, I should mention 64 did not require a college education. Employers say they have problem filling this vacancy. We think, well, maybe these vacancies can be filled easily because there are so many workers. After all, there is a 17% unemployment rate for non-college workers, and only 25% of all of them are employed. But 34% of the difficult to fill vacancies correspond to a non-college workers. What are the factors that the employers say that make it difficult to recruit non-college workers? They say this workers' attitude and work ethic, and that there are less persons with the required skills. And here there is a general profile of non-college workers. Actually, there are some mistakes in the table, 2 mistakes in this table. Just the general number of how many employees are there. There are 460,000 employees, non-college workers. The percent that are men, there is the mistake, should be 47, is 67% are men. This is very different from what you see when you see the college educated, where 47% are men, and the majority are women. But the non-college educated population are mainly men. Their mean age is 44 years old. 36% live in poverty, and when we look at the bottom third of the wage distribution, 61% of the people in the bottom third of the wage distribution do not have a college education. 14% are self-employed, and 18% are working for the government. Which are the required, what employers are required for this population? Well, the requirement for these jobs are not that stringent. 28% do not require any kind of experience. 31% require any kind of experience. Only 15% were giving a drug test. 45% was giving any kind of exam. But training was offered to 75%. And on the other side, I had the college educated, so you can compare. So what I see when I see this data is, on one side, it's good that the requirements are not stringent. But on the other side, what I see the pattern is that employers are very unwilling to invest in non-college workers. They're not given training enough. They're not requiring experience, with me. Also, they're not willing possibly to keep you with you. And then they don't give in drug tests, they don't give you exams. So it's a profile that seems like Puerto Rican employers are not very willing to invest in this population, maybe because they think they're going to come for a couple of months and go, whatever reason, but it seems like that's a story that comes out. In terms of what are the attributes most valued among non-college workers by employers, well, responsibility and punctuality. I mean, this is a topic that comes constantly, that employers want somebody who can open the shop on time, who is there at 9 o'clock, not at 9:15, that are responsible, the ability to follow instructions, and ability to work as part of a team. And these are the soft skills that are often identified in this kind of research for the non-college population. However, I guess what also is interesting from this research is that I'm able to compare with the college population, because I see most research, when I read it, tend to exaggerate how much is needed in terms of soft skill. They tend to say like, well, this non-college job require a lot of soft skill, and possibly college job doesn't require, well, they require that from college jobs too. And people want this punctuality and responsibility also from college training from jobs that require college too. So are not unique demands for non-college workers. Now our data said they require to a greater degree to non-college workers, but the difference is not like huge. I mean, there is some difference, like 5-6 percentage, but it's not huge. These are the particular skills that are demanded, and the percentage employers that are saying that they are demanding the skills. And there are 5 skills that are demanded by more than 1 in 2 of employers: reading Spanish, manual abilities, meeting schedules, speaking personally with clients, and writing Spanish, and handling priorities. So not all those skills are soft skills. Some of them are kind of higher level thinking skills. You have to, and when you go up, even when the percentage goes down, still there are, I mean, these jobs are not no-skill jobs. They actually require some soft skills, but some of them require also hard skills. They are not devoid of hard skill demands. These are, again, the 6 most demanded in terms of most of 50% or more of the employers demanded: reading, manual abilities, meeting schedules, speaking to clients, teamwork, and handling priorities. So non-college jobs demand a fair share of higher level thinking and emotional maturity skills. The skill that non-college workers use this skill more in comparison with college workers are manual and physical skills. What I did is compare to the ratio of employers that demand the skill for college and for non-college workers to see which one is more intensively demanded. So the skills that are more intensively demanded from non-college workers are the manual and physical skill, which in a way is not that surprising. However, what this also shows is that the college jobs, the skills that are more demanded and where the non-college workers are much behind are in English language abilities and computer abilities. So yes, we see the computer divide between college workers and non-college workers. These are the 2 skills. I mean, the English language ability and computer abilities are really where non-college workers, in terms of the abilities that are demanded, are much behind. I also make an analysis to see whether these workers are well positioned for the jobs where the demand is growing. Where the demand is growing in Puerto Rico, and I mean for that between the years I look, actually the number of employee workers declined by 4%. In the growing industry, the increase in employment was at least 10%. In some of this industry grew by 20%. So the growing demand for non-college workers are in real estate and leasing, health and social assistance, other services, finance, and accommodations. And this other is where they are declining. If you look at the declining industry, and I look at the literature, a lot of these industries are actually identified like high information and technology industries, where the weather is declining. And when you see the demand for skills in this industry, what I see is that the industries that are growing demand more skills from non-college workers, especially demanding English skill, computer skill, and thinking skill. They are demanding less manual and physical skill. So I think we have to be position these workers better to take these jobs of the future by offering them more thinking and emotional maturity skill and computer skills. This is the analysis I made. And what I concluded is that Puerto Rico cannot continue to forget about the half of its population that do not have a college education, that most job growth in Puerto Rico, after all, do not require college education, that the job openings for non-college workers in Puerto Rico require hard skills, not only soft skills. Employers show some degree of dissatisfaction with the soft skill of Puerto Rican workers. This makes the non-college labor market quite competitive, despite its long labor queue. Puerto Rico needs to increase the computer, thinking, and English language ability of its non-college bound graduates to better position them for the job of the future. This skill should not be thought of the privilege of only of the college workers. And Puerto Rico needs to develop non-traditional venues for skill acquisition of its adult non-college population. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Doctora. Last but not least, I don't know if I'm going to hold up the time cards for Edwin, but yeah, I will, right? Right, I'm going to do it. You keep time. You keep time. You keep time. All right. So now, Edwin Melendez is going to present a research that he and Ann has been working on: changes in the structure of low-wage labor markets and migration selectivity. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure to finally get a chance to talk. Kidding. So what Ann and I try to do in this paper is to talk about the feedback mechanism between the two economies and how those feedback effects affect the Puerto Rican labor force both here and there. And I'm not going to dwell too much into the definition of low-wage workers as we've gone through that. In any case, what I'd like to do is just provide you a little background on both the literature and the data, talk about the data, and then talk a little bit about the conceptual frameworks to understanding these flows, and then move to some preliminary findings. These are really preliminary, as we couldn't run all the things that we wanted, but they're enough to tell a story. So the first graph is about a very important development that in 2007, the census reported more Puerto Ricans living in the U.S. than living in Puerto Rico, and that has profound implications for the way we understand our community. And when you look at the United States, you're really talking about a very dispersed population, where the usual foci of our people are now disseminated throughout the whole nation. So as Joe and I were talking about how do we map this by SMSA and so forth, it becomes really complex. As all those issues about disparity in living standards between the regions become more prominent as you do the analysis. And as Ramon and I have struggled with, all those institutional caveats about how do you understand the feeder mechanism, the pathways, become even more complex because the reality varies so much. So in any case, I just wanted to pass around the data so you can keep it with you and keep it in mind as you keep working on other things. The next slide is about the net migration, and in here I just provide you an overview of what some of the trends in average net migration are. The reason why we need to combine data sets from the planning board is that up to very recently, 2005, the only way to assess these flows was the so-called ramp survey of the Puerto Rican Planning Board, and some people use the very imperfect census where did you live 5 years ago question to make all kind of implications about immigration. But in any case, it is what it is. In a longer study, we expect to have a more detailed analysis of these surveys and what difference does it make when you use these various data sources. In any case, that's not the topic of today's talk. So moving along, the first overview item is to try to explain why this issue of selectivity is so important to be understood. Why is it that we need to do research in this area? And for those of us, Corky and Luis Falcon and all the others, warriors that battled that underclass hypothesis way back in the early 80s, this was one of the mechanisms that was said to contribute to Puerto Rican poverty. And since then, that prejudice hasn't changed. And the question is, in fact, it has at some points, and in other points it hasn't. So the conversation today is more about under what circumstances and what periods we can actually say that there is a feedback, negative or positive effect from one economy to the other as it refers to human capital and to the labor market. It can contribute, if you have selectivity. Some people, Luis had a couple of papers on this, sitting in the back there laughing at me, about welfare recipiency and whether that was the main factor for bringing Puerto Ricans to the U.S. and so forth. So these are not casual issues. These are items that have been debated for decades now in the literature pertaining Puerto Rican migration. And finally, it could be that as we produce in both sides the best trained people, they actually just circulate between one place or the other, leaving behind those that have the worst characteristics to survive in labor markets, and that has profound implications for the way we think about training and so forth. So in the next slide, I just want to go now through a very quick periodization and how selectivity has affected migration flow in those big periods of time. And here, Luis did a paper a long time ago for the National Puerto Rican Coalition, I think it was, talking about the political economy of migration, but not the way Frank did, talking about capitalism and all that, but just from the point of view of macroeconomic conditions and how that may affect the logic of these flows. And what we do know, it's very, very well established, and in the paper, Ann and I constructed a very detailed table of all the citations that are out there in the literature, over probably 25, 30 studies, organized by periods and the various variables that they use to talk about selectivity, whether education or occupations and what have you. So what comes out of that wealth of data is that in the early migration decades, the 40s and the 50s, los que se iban de la isla, there were more skills than the non-migrant population. There was some kind of positive selectivity, and those that returned actually returned with more education and so forth. So, very well-known researchers in Puerto Rico refer to that as the training ground, that the migration was beneficial to the island and justifying all the policies of the Muñoz administration. Actually, Gardo Melendez is producing a book on that period and all the policies and so forth, so this will be a nice complement to that. But the fact is that the policies to bring us to the U.S. were pushed under that logic that it was good for us to export workers and they will return back and contribute to economic development. And indeed, there was some evidence about those better educated people going back and forth and in these flows. In the late, Frederick, in the late 60s and early 1970s, there was making conclusions about so much papers is sometimes hard, but I will say that there was pretty much a period of parity there, as some return migration to the island started to balance out a little bit the flows one way or the other. And if you are a traditional economist trained in regional analysis, you know that those flows respond to wage differentials and what have you, and to the extent that they're random, they will tend to reflect the occupational structure. So, if it continues like that, we will pretty much, as the wage disparity converges, we will converge in occupational structures as well, which of course hasn't happened. But in any case, this is the period where we started seeing return migrations to Puerto Rico. In the 70s and the 80s, we have a profound economic crisis. This is the dismantling of labor-intensive manufacturing, the time where we tried to experiment with oil refineries and what have you. But it was a profound crisis in the 70s, and it lasted to the 80s. And then we started seeing some negative selectivity in terms of the people that came, which will correlate with low-wage labor market flows. So that evidence was somewhat consistent with the hypothesis of the reserve army that Frank Bonilla, Ricardo Campos, and others advanced, which is a logic where the proletariat basically go back and forth, and more recently Duane calls that transnationalism and the integration of that low-wage labor market. In any case, I will say that if anything, this study shows some mixed evidence for one way or the other. And I think in my own judgment. It really has to do with the economic conditions and this macro-political economy, where the economy is heading. Right now, the Puerto Rico economy is in the toilet. And, you know, there's what Loida and Frank, what was the technical term? Yeah. Did you get that? The Puerto Rican economy is in the toilet. I mean, it's a pronounced crisis begun way before the crisis in the U.S. And what they depicted in that economy is really that the private sector is not generating good jobs. So therefore, there's a push factor of people with better qualities taking jobs that normally will be for other people with lower skills. So they are more selective. They don't want to invest in the workers because why do they have to invest if they can get more qualified people and so forth? I think that's part of the so-called political economy of the situation. In any case, you can summarize all these arguments with the next one. Okay, with kind of taking the typical regional analysis or classical framework. These others will be the parting arguments about that hypothesis, right? Kind of the prevalent way that economists and sociologists look at these migration flows, or at least the selectivity in those migration flows. So, obviously I mentioned Frank and others in this reserve army, other people call it globalization, but the point is that the low strata of the labor markets are so connected and people go back and forth and there's a circular migration and all those peoples are just recycling, like nomads. There are even books that are called the Puerto Rican population nomadic, because they go back and forth. So that's one hypothesis. On the other hand, some people have talked about the brain drain, the brain drain, and even Dennis this morning was talking about the export of doctors and so forth and then importing. It was kind of a recycling. In any case, in the Indian case, there's an initiative that sustained that those quotas that we grant them to come and be trained at Stanford and become engineers and so forth, eventually those people go back. So you have this circular flow of the elite. They come back to Silicon Valley and so forth. So those hypotheses have been somewhat used in the case of Puerto Rican migration to some extent. There are articles in the newspaper about engineers massively flowing to Houston and God knows what else. But anyway, so those are hypotheses that we need to pay attention to because they've been used. But I think, and the training ground was historical, and actually there was some evidence of that. So we need to look at all those ways of explaining the logic of these migration flows. So one of the things that happened, so losing the PowerPoint, is that in recent years we got the American Community Survey in both sides. In Puerto Rico, you have a large enough sample year to year that allows now, it's a game changer for me, because now you have data that you can year to year track not only how many people go back and forth, but detailed characteristics about occupation, immigration, labor force status, and so forth. It has a problem, as I will show in my next graph, okay? The data that you have is at the time they are in the different region or country, okay? So you don't know what they had, like in the RAM survey, was taken when they left. So I don't think this fully substitutes the RAM survey because you don't have detailed information as to what they did when they left. The RAM survey also asks about whether you have a job or not, and that data is priceless. That's why I milk it as every opportunity that I have. Because that question, when I ask you, do you have a job? Are you going because you have a job? I mean, it's valuable. It's invaluable. So now we have to use all kind of proxies for unemployment and structural factors, and complicates your life. But anyway, the logic of the data set is that it's very simple. We take let me do this more creatively. So you have these people in this survey in Puerto Rico, but you really want to compare the characteristics of the people who return to the area that sent them to Puerto Rico. Okay, so that's the logic, and vice versa. Get it? Okay, I hope. But it's not that complicated. You're basically reorganizing the data set so that you can make comparisons that allow you to look at migrants in relation to a reference population of when they left. Okay, that's all that says. Now, the next step is a bit more complicated, which is, okay, what are the factors that influence migration? And I was hoping to have a very nice model. We actually did run a baseline model with the left-hand side variables, the personal characteristics, because I believe so strongly on wage differentials and unemployment rates and so forth, I'd rather not present those findings right now. But until we kind of figure out a way to create all those variables with this complication of moving population from one to the other, because the reference group changes, and Corky is saying, yeah, because she knows, and that Arthur is saying, oh yeah, you got a problem. Well, yeah, we know we have a problem. But the labor market outcomes we know, and the personal characteristics we know, the networks we can proxy with Puerto Rican population in various sectors in the U.S. and so forth. So the model is almost there. The hardest part is this feature weight differentials and unemployment differentials because of the reference population and how do you account for this. But we're almost there. Anyway, when we do get to that, we will have a more refined model. But here are some preliminary findings of the study. The first table, how am I doing in time? No, plenty of time. You're too generous.
I was just
speak fast.
Yeah, I know you speak fast.
Well, okay, so coming back to the presentation here. This table is about looking at the non-low wage and low wage. So I split the population using Anna's definition this morning. 2/3 of the median wage for men and women by SMSA, which is kind of what Joe was using as well. Anyway, and then we look at various indicators, age, education, and occupation for now. We also have labor status, but as I said, that's a bit more complicated. Anyway, so the age profile that we have here, we use a simple parity index here. So if it's equal to 1, what it means is that people who migrate are equally represented in the occupational category, or in this case, age group cohort, as they are in Puerto Rico or the U.S., whatever the reference population is. It's very straightforward. So if it's more than 1, and you can actually interpret it as percent-wise. So if it's 1.5, it's 50% higher than whatever the norm is. Now, it's a little misleading to look at it that way. It's like odds ratio. Why? Because the base could be 2, but it could be 5. So, how much so how many people are leaving by age group is a different question. And I have those numbers of the flows, but I don't want to complicate the argument here. Just to look at, is there any selectivity, yes or no? This is what you came to hear. So I'm giving you that, no more. This is it. Okay, so is there more overrepresentation, and where? Well, look at this. Puerto Rican men in the non-low wage migrate at a much higher rate in the early years. That makes a lot of sense. It's very consistent with the training hypothesis, and women as well. But this is not. This is consistent with all kinds of theories. People leave in the early years, they experiment, they make a mistake, they go back. Or they can get jobs, right? Because of the economy and how it works, and they're competitive with all these people in a crowded private sector in Puerto Rico. And so there you go. Young people are in the non-low wage sector are leaving. So that's kind of the punchline. There are other variations there, but that's the most significant one. So the next table talks about education. And again, the same parity ratio, looking at non-low wage and low wages. And what we get from here is a very interesting situation, whether you look at any column, but particularly the low wage for men, the more education you have, the higher the disparity of those who leave or come. Okay, I find that fascinating. It's a tremendous selectivity by education, whether you're no wage or low wage. True, it is more pronounced for the low wage for men and for women, but nonetheless, in this, I'm looking at the left hand side of those return migration to Puerto Rico relative to workers in the U.S. And there is somewhat similar effect, though a little bit more nuisance, on the right-hand side of Puerto Rican migration to the U.S. relative to workers in Puerto Rico, descending population. Anyway, this, I guess the phrase that I use is this not your lumpen proletariat traveling, as low wage or high wage, doesn't matter. These are educated people. So here we go again. How do we figure it out now? People, this is a little validation for what Dennis was saying, but I'm not quite sure. For one, the educational categories need to be disaggregated more. This is just a conference presentation. And that point is also true for my last slide in terms of the data, which is by occupation. Now, the prior studies that I published on this have like 16 occupational categories, which allows you to have a more kind of interesting story than when you only have 5 or 6 categories. And obviously, 16 is too long. We couldn't really finish all the tables with the planning board thing, so I'm just taking a piece out of it. And there is some selectivity, but it's not tremendously evident that you may have particular sectors, that are overwhelmingly, let's say farming and fishing. But what is that? I mean, it's like 10,000 people. It's really minute, so it's not. I should have put not available, not to confuse the story here. But anyway, it is what it is. So there's no prima facie evidence. I mean, I think if I go to 400 occupations, I'll find some occupations that will have this. I hope that when I go to 16, it'll show a little more interesting stories here. But the punchline of all this is that I think there is some tremendous selectivity by education, and whether we can actually talk about a training ground or a push factor from education is all things that need to be hypothesized. I do know that human capital, we have such a strong model. The odds ratios are to the roof, and so we know what's negative and what's positive. We know what was the relative. I'm going to give you 2 minutes back. So we know all that, and unfortunately, I don't represent that base model until I have the more structural factors embedded within the tables. But in any case, more work remains to be done. Thank God. Thank you.
Okay, we invite Dr. Arthur McEwen, University of Massachusetts, who's our discussant. Bienvenido.
Well, I have the privilege of being the last speaker, which means that either you're too tired to pay any attention to what I have to say, but at least you can't have an opportunity to really answer me. Let me put the papers in a little context. What these papers, and indeed what the whole conference is about, is how do we improve the position of what Maria has referred to as the forgotten half of the population. And by improving the condition of the bottom of the forgotten half, we're also concerned with improving the condition of the entire economy. Now, 2 things, it seems to me, have to be placed in what we remind ourselves of to go at this issue. One is the terrible condition, I'm not going to use vulgar terms to describe the Puerto Rican economy, but let's just say terrible. It's in the toilet, he's right. That you need a vulgar term to describe the situation. And one of the reasons that it's important is it's very difficult to think about improving the condition of people at the bottom without improving the overall condition of the economy. The second aspect of a context which seems important for all these papers is the extremely high degree of inequality in the distribution of income that exists in Puerto Rico. It also seems to me that it is quite difficult to do anything about the forgotten half without reducing this degree of inequality. That is, even if we raise the absolute position in terms of income of people at the bottom, it's not clear that we're significantly changing their position if the income inequality remains the same. With those remarks about context, let me turn to some particular comments about the individual papers that were presented in this session. Regarding Maria Anchantigue's presentation, there's a great deal of much more than she was able to present here today, of useful description of labor market conditions. And I want to note just a couple of the points that are brought out by way of underscoring them. one of those is the current expectation that employment growth among low-wage workers, or those categories of jobs which are occupied by low-wage workers, will experience a great deal of growth in the coming years. Now, that has a mixed message to me. On the one hand, it seems to bode very well for the forgotten half. That is to say, there are going to be jobs for these people. On the other hand, it suggests that the structure of employment is going to remain extremely unequal, that these are jobs at the bottom. These are not jobs that are going to move low-wage workers up in their position. So this job expectation picture seems to carry a complicated and mixed message. The other point from her paper that I want to emphasize is this issue about the kinds of skills that employers see as missing. Now, in a way, what she brings out about Puerto Rico is nothing new, and I don't mean in that sense to denigrate it. It's important to keep making this point over and over again, and I'll say why in just a moment. And that is, what's important to employers is that people come on time and they follow directions. Now, I'm familiar with studies of Nigeria in 1960, of Massachusetts in 1840, that say exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. Those are what employers are after. Now, isn't it interesting that those are the things that employers are after, yet what we do is test students all the time. What's wrong with Puerto Rican schools? Well, they don't do very well on the national, what is that?
Pruebas puertorriqueñas. That's what it's
No. There's a new, the thing, the national survey that's done across the country. Yeah, it's the National Assessment of Education. National Assessment of Education Performance, Progress, right? And Puerto Ricans don't do very well. This is just being introduced in the last 2 years in Puerto Rico. But that's what we test. But that's not what employers are concerned about. And that seems to me to deserve a great deal of emphasis. The tests, even if they were good tests, don't do what employers want to know. And that's another point I want to come back to in a few moments. Now, regarding the paper by Melendez and Weiser, it again brings out far more particulars about the migration in the process and the relation between migration and the condition of low-wage workers. Some of their observations are not particularly surprising, but are nonetheless quite important. For example, giving the renewed attention to the emphasis on the interaction of economic conditions in the States and the economic conditions in Puerto Rico as explaining the process of migration, how it changes in various periods in time. The problem is of course very complicated right now because things are very bad in the United States. We heard more about that at lunch, and particularly bad for Puerto Ricans and other Latinos. But they're worse in Puerto Rico. And so how does this play out, not only in terms of overall migration, but in who's migrating and why? I mentioned to Edwin that any paper that has lots of boxes and diagrams and arrows in it is one that appeals to me. I love diagrams like that. Nonetheless, God only knows how it works right now. And where those arrows go and what kind of coefficients to put on them is, of course, quite complicated. So it's important to try, but nonetheless, it's important to try to figure out and how it will play out in the current situation and what this means for low-wage workers. Now, on the issue of brain drain, that is another important aspect of the migration issue. I want to make a comment. There's been, and this is mentioned but not emphasized in their paper, there's been an approach to this which says, well, look, highly educated people aren't leaving Puerto Rico in a higher rate relative to their share of the population that are low-income people. Therefore, there's not really a brain drain. But what that misses is the different roles of people with different degrees of education in the economy. Puerto Rico, in relation to the States at least, if not in relation to the rest of the world, is a poor economy. That is a low-income economy. That suggests that the people with the high incomes are the ones that are in high demand. So whereas there is an excess supply of the people at the low end. So if people at the low end are leaving, that's not a problem in relation to the development of the Puerto Rican economy. If the same proportion are leaving at the high end, that's a brain drain. That is, in relation to their demand for their services, it's a problem. It's a problem. Or perhaps I shouldn't say demand, I should say need. It's a very different concept, but I won't go into that. So I think that needs more careful and more thorough consideration when we're trying to understand that process. Now, regard to the paper that Angel and Luida present, again, lots of useful information. The data that they present on the occupational and industrial structure that tells us where low-wage work is concentrated in Puerto Rico seems to me an extremely useful, if not absolutely necessary, first step in thinking about the policies that might be adopted in an effort to change the situation. It's very hard to attack low-wage work in general. We got to know where it is and where it stands. Now, their information seems to me a very nice complement to Maria Antalchegue's paper in this regard. It gives us a more detailed sense of what's going on. Now, the other aspect of their work that seems to me valuable is the work on the gender issues. Not just in terms of what they said with regard to the progress that's been made, but what we know from all other work on poverty in general and low-wage work is that there has been, however one wants to define it, a feminization of poverty. That men and women are different in their economic situations. And if you don't look at that, and if you don't start to get some picture of it, you're not going to be able to do things, provide the services, provide the support programs, and so on. So this aspect of their work also strikes me as particularly useful as a foundation for thinking about policies in this realm. Now, one of the things I liked about all three of these papers is that they lead me to all sorts of questions of things that they didn't do. Now, it's never a criticism of a paper to say what they didn't do. In fact, quite the contrary, that they didn't do all sorts of things that one is led to ask about is a very positive statement about these papers. Let me list some of these without trying to identify exactly where they come from, because they mix up a lot of the papers. One of the questions I want to know about is why is the dropout rate in Puerto Rican schools so high? Incidentally, the figure was 40% that you mentioned. Well, if you look at the official data presented along with the states by the U.S. government, the dropout rate for Puerto Rico is 1%. Yeah, it's total nonsense. I mean, it's just total nonsense. And I know. I mean, these are some of the data problems which I want to return to at the end. But anyway, why did they drop out? I mean, is it a problem with the schools, or is it a problem with the social environment, or is it a problem with the economic opportunities? There's of course, all of them. But there has been a presumption in much of what I've seen that the problem's in the schools. The schools are no good. But it's never that simple. So that's certainly an issue if one is going to talk about the condition of low-wage workers in Puerto Rico that has to be addressed. But insofar as the problem is the schools, and insofar as employers are concerned about these behavioral traits that are developed in the schools about coming on time, for example, why is it that Puerto Rican employers don't try to do something about the schools? Why has that success or the attempt been so very limited? This seems to me important. To move on to some other questions that affect all these things, how is the unique position of Puerto Rico in relation to the United States, this peculiar or particular colonial experience, how does this affect the position of low-wage workers in Puerto Rico? Is there a safety valve phenomena? Certainly many writers think that the safety valve has been crucial to the early positive developments in the post-war period. On the other hand, one can think of various complications that are involved here. For example, maybe the reason people drop out of school is they say, I'm not going to go to college anyway. If I drop out of school, I can go get a construction job in the United States 6 months every year and come back. And I'm all right. I live at the standard of Puerto Rico. I earn income for 6 months in the United States. What's going on? And this brings me to another kind of question. That is, how does the Puerto Rican migration experience compare with other migration experiences, both internationally and within the United States? For example, how does the Puerto Rican migration experience compare with the migration from West Virginia and Appalachia generally? Is the Puerto Rican experience dramatically different, or what's going on? And we might learn something. I've never seen that particular issue addressed. One can go on with the question of the relation to the United States in terms of the perversion of the structure of the economy, this over-bloated manufacturing sector that has existed, that was in large part first brought into existence by so-called Operation Bootstrap, and then maintained in a way by Section 936. Of course, what Section 936 did was create a huge amount of profits for foreign companies, but that's another whole issue. Well, I could go on and on with the question of comparisons. It seems to me that too much of the analysis is Puerto Rico and U.S. specific when we can learn a lot by comparisons. I mentioned the West Virginia example, but the same thing could be said of how's it different from Italian migration in the early part of the last century, and the return issue, and so on. We learn a lot from that. Or, well, what was said about the gender gap in Puerto Rico, I'd like to see that put in the context of what's happened to the gender gap elsewhere, in order to figure out what problems are peculiar to Puerto Rico, what problems are peculiar to Puerto Rico, and what are general problems that are faced in many, many countries, in order to figure out what to do. And finally, as I mentioned when I commented on one of the earlier papers this morning, there's what I call the cliff effect. And what role does this play in keeping people at the bottom? That is, the social programs that we provide are so often based on income tests that people say, it's not worth it to go through all these programs to raise myself up. I'd like to, but in Massachusetts, as I mentioned, you've got to go from $8 to $16 before you start breaking even again, an hour. Because you lose your housing, you lose your child care, you lose your health care, and various other things along the way. And I've never seen anything said about this in the Puerto Rican context. And it would be useful to think about that as well. Well, to end up, let me raise one issue that may seem a little extraneous, but it's we each have our hobby horses to ride, and this is mine of late. Each of these papers is based, I think, on rather careful use of data, and that's one of the very good things about them. I like, it's fun to speculate, it's fun to spin theories, but in fact, we believe in evidence-based policies, or at least we like to think we do. When I watch the healthcare debate in Washington, I sometimes wonder, but that's all right. Now, if the Puerto Rican economy is in the toilet, the Puerto Rican official, I don't even want to say where the Puerto Rican official data are. Now, you noticed in the paper when they presented the data on what happened between 2000 and 2008, they did it in current dollars. They did it in current dollars because the consumer price index is useless in Puerto Rico. Now, how do you know what's going on in Puerto Rico if you don't have a consumer price index of some reliability? I mean, just to tell you what's going on, if you look at it either in the last few years or if you look at it as far back as 1980, it seems that Puerto Rican prices rose twice as fast as prices in the United States. Puerto Rico is tied in with the U.S. economy in an intimate manner. Prices could not have gone up twice as fast. Furthermore, we know something about the reasons for this. The Institute of Statistics in Puerto Rico has put out a big paper that shows some of the reasons, but nothing has changed. We have similar problems. I mentioned the dropout rate reports vary from 1 to 40%. The data in the schools are terrible. The presentation of real gross national product and aggregates are presented in 1954 prices. Now, you don't have to be an economist who's studied price indices and so on to sort of get the picture that there's something wrong. That there's something, I mean, just for example, since computers didn't exist in 1954, their price was infinite. Now, how do you factor that into a price index? You tell me. Well, in tackling these problems, whatever our particular professional background is, whether we're economists or sociologists or whatever, we need some data to work with. Good policy depends upon good analysis, and good analysis depends upon good data. So if I can leave you with anything, it's a plea to scream at the Puerto Rican government, to scream at the people you know in the Puerto Rican government, and tell them that they've got to do something.
We're tired of screaming.
These are the people, I'm not talking to you people in Puerto Rico. See, Angel, he comes up with his input-output is, why is he able to do that? It's because he goes to his friends in the government, and they give him the data. They give him, which is fine, but it doesn't solve the problem for analysis in general. You can't rely on friendships alone as a basis for getting data. So some of us are trying to do something about this, and I would urge you all to take part in that process. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think it would be fair to have our presenters comment on Dr. McEwen's. If there's any comments.
Why don't we take a couple
first, or do you want to take? Okay, I thought maybe you had some things or suggestions. Let's take questions then. Okay, Luis Reyes first.
My question is, what matters most? That employees serve the needs of the economy and the labor market, or that the economy and the labor market serve the needs of the employees, if we think of employees as citizens?
Do you want our presenters or Dr. McEwen?
Whomever.
I think that's
Again,
a rhetorical question.
that's a heavy one. Who wants to?
Well, I mean,
You got a lot of economists, a couple economists here.
I'm going to pass on that one.
Brave soul. And
I'll
McEwen.
answer. I mean, there's no, the economy is like, one of the problems with economics and the discussion is we talk about the economy. They're only people. They're only people. And if something doesn't work for people, I mean, my favorite is, remember, those of us among us who are old enough may remember when the Brazilian president came to the United States in 1967. He was one of the generals who had taken over. And he was asked, how are things in Brazil? How's the economy doing? And he said, the economy's doing pretty well, but the people aren't. And first of all, it was shocking that he could say that, but that he could take this separation between the economy and the people was absurd in itself. So it seems to me that if once you make that separation, you're in a sense lost.
Okay.
I asked the question in the context of your asking government to get better data, and my view that one of the roles of government is to serve the people that put it in power, or put it there one way or the other, and if their needs are to be educated versus the employer's needs to have people who are punctual and reliable. What's the role of government?
We don't have a government.
I wouldn't dare answer right now about the government of Puerto Rico. I think it's difficult what's happening, and it's a very touchy situation, especially when the government just put out at the end of January 17,000 workers. So I think we should go with Dr. McNewan's answer. Next question. Yes, Doctor.
Yeah, I have a question about the way we interpret being high wage and the migration. If someone is high wage because they have a more education, advanced degrees, and professional skills, I don't think that tells us that they are necessarily in excess demand. It may be that actually they could be not needed, not finding the jobs they want in Puerto Rico, and in fact, what's been happening to their wages might be a good thing to look at to see whether they are a brain drain or whether they're in a sense being pushed out because there aren't sufficient opportunities to soak them up. I don't know the answer, but I just think I need to look at that dimension.
King.
The data, I mean, this is just scripted data, so it's hard to say, other than impressionistic statements about this is what I think is going on. I think, but the model shows, just looking at the human capital component, a very kind of ladder. The higher you go, the higher the probability. So if one of the models we're trying is conditional probability. You have served, for education and so forth. It's just the more educated you are, the more likely you are to migrate. Right now, that's not a historical truth. It's just it's what the data is showing now. And because this data set is so early, I expect a lot of flack from the research community, because it's the first time I would say this survey is used this particular way to assess this particular issue. So I'm expecting my economists to jump all over the reference groups and all, and all these implications that you make, because the salary that you're reporting is the one they have in the United States when they left. You don't know anything about what they have, right? Therefore the difficulty. I think I will control a little bit by that, by looking at wage differentials by occupation and industries. You have a large enough matrix, you may have a little control for that, and then just assume that whatever they get in the U.S. is a variation of. You have to assume that they were in the same occupation and industry as they were in Puerto Rico, which is absolutely, but you have to make some assumptions to test this hypothesis. So, as we move along, I'm sure, when Arthur gets to read the full-fledged paper, we will improve in the way we understand the use of ACS data for this analysis. But right now, the Puerto Rican Planning Board, they just decide not to collect the data. So you have 3-4 years gap because they don't have the budget to do it. And you go like, gee. And the only reason why they do it is not because they want researchers to understand it. It's because it relates to the expenses of tourism in the economy. That's what they really care. And and that's, the motivation. But anyway, but it's better than the flow of passengers, which was our measure of migration for 3 decades, right? So all these things are relative. I'm just happy that we have that data now that we can play with a little bit more.
Elvin,
Algo más.
We are financing the planning board now, the Institute of Statistics.
Oh, there you go.
I am the vice president, and we are giving them a grant.
Well, you have plenty of people to hire here, you know.
No, I mean to install again the airport survey. So it was approved last week. So they are going to start doing it again.
So for the first time in a couple of years, we will have data from the two data sets and be able to compare what difference does it make when you do this analysis. But right now you can't, because there's no overlapping at any time.
But there is something else that she said about whether, in fact, the data says it's a brain drain or it's related to uncomfortable wages and low wages. I think there was a mini informal study, and I'd like to, if you were there a couple of months ago, where in fact a lot of the doctors, medical doctors, I think it was not just among pediatricians, uno de los grupos de médicos, that they were questioned why were they leaving, and the response is the wages in Puerto Rico for specialists are so low that it's finding, you know, so it is a brain drain, but it has a specific reason. I don't know if you'd like to make another comment on that.
Yes, in a part of our research, we found out that in 2000, about 159 out of 556 occupations were below the median, and in 2008, of those 556 occupations, 83% were below the median. And
huge gap.
it's very surprising because the occupations falling in this decrease under the median, the leaders are managerial professional, like business and financial operations, architecture and engineering, light physical and social science occupations, and all health-related occupations. So it has to do with the downgrading of the economy and the erosion of the wage base in the economy. And that's the reason why many professionals may be also migrating.
Can we take another one? There is someone here. Yes.
Yes, about the other half we were talking about. Is there any data, or are you looking into the fact that a lot of these companies or these manufacturers or these markets that are hiring non-college employees do not offer job stability and benefits, and they will let them go like every couple of months and then rehire over again? That was my experience when I was there, and I mean, and family members of mine, they're in construction, they're laid off a couple of months, they don't have any health benefits, and then you're forced to go into, you know, the public support system or assistance, and again they'll hire again. So these are the skills they're demanding from employees, but what are they offering?
Yeah. Well, about 30% of the non-college workers got a job with health insurance, and that's similar to college workers. But the 30%. About 30%. But the construction industry, particularly seasonal, and yes, there is a lot of coming out and coming in, and that's what I see. I mean, that they really not putting a lot of interest in retaining this job, but I think we really don't know, because we don't know how. I mean, we don't see the history of these workers to see how much how long they are staying in this job. But I think you're right. I think there must be a lot of instability in the experience of the work experience of these workers.
So, Edwin, I don't know if you want to come up and I think wrap this up. You want me to wrap it up? All right. Is there one last question? One last comment? One last bendición? Peace? Okay, one more.
This is for Edwin. This is about the, this isn't so much on whether or not you have a selective migration or not, but your model where you showed a decision to migrate based on an economic calculus. And I'm kind of going to be the sociologist here. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about migration because I've been studying residential segregation, and I have really come to the conclusion that people are moving to places they know people. That seems overwhelmingly important. When Puerto Ricans decide, well, when Puerto Ricans in the United States, they go to the island, they could go all over. There could be any number of places where the economic calculus would be better, but they return to the islands, and people from the island come to the United States, and there's these like social ties, and it's just. I was wondering if you thought about how you might capture anything like that, but I mean that seems like an important thing.
In the model we have social networks on the upper corner, which is the pull factor. Part of the pull factors is the information they provide about social services and so forth. So for me that's not difficult because we can use a proxy as Puerto Ricans in the area or or recent migrants to the area or some other proxy. So I'm not too worried about that. That's I think it's fine. I find it easier to model social networks as they control migration flows, than it is to assess the influence of differences in social services. Now, you can use proxies like benefits received, but I don't think those are the real challenges in terms of the model. I think it's more, for instance, in HIV treatment. You don't get the same type of benefits you get in the States as you get there. So that's the level of health services, educational services, the quality of schools. So there are a lot of these kind of differences in the quality of life, which I think are important as the calculus, the cost benefit. And how do you model that is a little bit more challenging. But we're using proxies in terms of the welfare that they receive and that kind of thing. But I don't think that's enough. I think looking at the institutional context, the number of community organizations might be in the area, but adding those variables to the model becomes a bit more of a challenge. But I agree with you. But I think the social networks is easier, not easy, but easier than these other intangibles, which we know influence the migratory flows.
Yeah, it was more of a comment on theoretically that the networks are not part of the calculus.
They're independent.
It's not part of an economic calculus.
I'll put them in a different box, but
there's something else besides the economic calculus.
I put them as pull factors because they provide information more and a sofa in your sofa bed in your living room. But yeah.
I think the other factors would take some more time to discuss because these are economic factors, but I can think of the sociological and the psychological factors that are involved in the economic opportunities. So for today, I think we're through. We'd like to thank you all, the presenters, the ones that came from Puerto Rico, the ones that came from Massachusetts and different New Jersey. I think there's some people here and I've just met. So thank you so much for coming. And I know all of this is going to be finalized and published, right?
Yes.
So you will get the final products of this, and those of us in the center will continue to work on certain themes. I just want to end with one note that has to do with you as a sociologist and me as a psychologist. You mentioned something about people returning to their point, and where we put those kinds of issues. Just the other night, we sponsored Lloyd Rogler. May I say this? And there's a very lovely thing that he uses in his book, which I'm going to be writing on, Barrio Professors. At one point he talks about querencia. Querencia is a term that's very hard to translate, and it talks about how there's a tendency, this is in animals, we're animals, social animals, to return to the point of being, to the point of best known. You were talking about networks where people return, and those are not things that we can measure in boxes and coefficients. But the tendency is the people in the migration try to return to that which they know. And when they don't, then we have a certain set of other situations occurring, which are the ones that I write and study. So with that in mind, querencia to all of you, return to the point of your comfort, and thank you.